Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give it about one more minute. We still have some people signing on, so I want to give everybody just a little extra time to get situated and signed on, and then we'll begin at about 1 minute after the hour. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Carrie Pascal, Director of Outreach at Team Guardify. Prior to this role, I worked directly with child advocacy centers and at a district attorney's office, providing services to families and victims. Guardify, if you're not familiar with our company, is a digital evidence management solution designed to support child advocacy centers, child protective services, prosecutors, advocates, law enforcement, and others across the country in securely managing, storing, and safeguarding critical evidence. We're honored today to host today's webinar, Breaking Barriers, Understanding and Empowering Survivors of Sexual Assault. At Guardify, we are committed to supporting victim-serving agencies with innovative technology, and with that, we stand in solidarity with all survivors of sexual assault. Oh, I need to change the slide. I'm sorry. Okay, a couple of housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our presenter. If you'd like a copy of the presentation slides today, you can access them in the chat box. My coworker Melissa is going to drop them in the chat box. She's going to do so a couple of times during the presentation. So if you are looking for them, please just check the chat box. Please look out for an email that you'll receive later this afternoon that will explain how you can complete the evaluation form, which will then give you your certificate of completion for today's webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the Q&A box. We've got a very large group attending today, so our presenter is going to wait until the very end to address all questions. If we're unable to get your question answered during our time today that is live, we are going to have all questions answered by our presenter and sent to you all via email. Okay. I want you all to be aware of some upcoming events and exciting news. On Thursday, April 24th, we are hosting our next live webinar called Building Bridges, Collaborative Approaches for Navigating Problematic Sexual Behavior. So please be on the lookout soon for registration information. And also, if you have not checked out Guardify's Real Evidence podcast, please do so. Join Ashley and Myron as they explore how technology, people, and processes unite to reshape the landscape of justice and community. Subscribe now. Okay, I'm so excited now to be able to introduce today's presenter, Clarence October. Clarence is the Advocacy Director at Arise Sexual Assault Services in New Mexico, where he provides essential support to survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and trauma across 6 counties. Driven by a passion for community empowerment, he focuses on innovative strategies to address the unique needs of underserved populations. Clarence takes pride in developing educational training programs and building a strong advocacy team that prioritizes staff well-being. An advocate for LGBTQIA2S+ rights, he is also deeply involved in the Lavender Project, working to expand resources and outreach in rural New Mexico. A creative problem solver, Clarence excels in designing sustainable support programs and leading interactive workshops for both professionals and survivors. His work is rooted in the principles of autonomy, inclusion, and resilience, leaving a lasting and positive impact on the communities he serves. We are so excited to hear from Clarence today. And with that, Clarence, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're the one they want to hear from today. So let's get started.
Fantastic. So, well, welcome everybody to Breaking Barriers, Understanding and Empowering Survivors of Sexual Assault. I do want to take a moment and thank Guardify for having me and allowing me this opportunity to not only share like my passion for advocacy work, but highlight the work of organizations like my own, like Arise. And I'm really thrilled to get to be here today and talk to everyone about supporting survivors. This is my passion. And so I really like being able to bridge the gap between like professional advocacy and community advocacy. I really want to just add a quick note that my perspective is kind of shaped by the fact that I am an LGBTQ plus advocate. That is where my journey as an advocate started. And I also do animal welfare advocacy here in rural New Mexico. And I've been with Arise for about 2 years, which is what shifted my focus to being a sexual violence and domestic violence advocate. I do also want to let you know that my ADHD superpower does tend to be, I get super excited. I talk real fast. So if at any point I'm going too quickly, somebody please just say, hey, slow down. Like, I don't know, send a stop sign if we have that as an option in our reactions. I want to add some of my important rules and then invite y'all to create this space with me real quick. You will see there is a QR code and a canva.live room code. If you want to interact with me and respond to kind of some of my questions that I will be having, you can scan the QR code from your phone and join the Canva live session, which will allow you to send anonymous messages and responses back in, or from a desktop, you can go to canva.live, add that room code, and be able to interact when I do ask questions, since we're going to try to leave the Zoom chat box a little clear for Guardify to share with y'all really important things. So why some of y'all decide if you're going to join me in this space, the first thing I have as my important rules why we're here today is that I want this to be a brave space, okay? I would like you to feel free to ask any questions, comments, or concerns as they come up for you. I am really the type of person that there is no such thing as a silly or stupid question. And if we were to maybe ask a question that we shouldn't directly ask to maybe a survivor or somebody in a marginalized community, I'm pretty good about here's the answer we need and how to ask that in a more trauma-informed, mindful way. I do also want to let you know throughout this time, we will be using some correct legal and medical terms. I say this because I want you to be prepped for anything that might be activating or triggering for you as a person. Talking about sexual violence tends to be really heavy stuff. And I also know that we can't talk about sexual violence if we don't actually talk about sexual violence. So please, last important thing, take space as you need it. No pressure to me if you have to mute me or step away for a minute. I'm also not the type of person who's like, yes, your continuing education credits are more important than your mental health. I really want you to take space if needed. And then if you are being bold, we're joining the Canva Live so that we can interact with me. Please go ahead and let me know what sector you're in, so that I kind of know maybe who's in the room with us right now and what our specialties are. Are we mostly advocates? Are we mostly legal? I just want to know a little bit. All right, in a perfect world where I have timed myself beautifully, this is what we'll get through and then have enough time for questions at the end, hopefully. First thing, we're going to talk about services available to survivors. I am going to do that through the framework of my organization. And while I understand not everybody is from New Mexico, I'll share with you what I know about other states and what they're doing. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the sexual violence statistics nationally and the stigma impacting survivors. We're going to talk about advocacy and why I think everybody is about to walk out of this presentation, go into their community, and be the best advocates possible. And then we're going to talk about identifying and working with survivors. And then I just have a little fun bit at the end, okay? So before we get into the real heavy stuff, I want to share some definitions with us. I'm doing this because while I assume a lot of us might have shared definitions, I also understand that all of us are in a little different sectors in life. We're in different communities. We're in different parts of the country. And so I want us to have a shared definition for what these words will mean when you hear me say them today. The first one I want to share is sexual violence. This is going to be our big umbrella. It is our catch-all terminology. Sexual violence includes criminal and non-criminal acts against individuals. So it really encompasses everything from like stalking, completed and attempted rape, harassment, coercion, all the way to something like catcalling, which isn't technically a criminal crime in most legal systems, but it is a form of violence against others. Under that, we have sexual assault, and this is any unwanted sexual acts specifically that are illegal under state, federal, or tribal law. So this is what we're typically thinking of, like fondling and rape falls under sexual assault. Sexual abuse is when an individual is unable to give consent due to age, disability, or any other contributing factors. So most typically when we talk about sexual abuse, that's normally with minors because their age keeps them out of consenting. Coercion is the use of threats or violence, but also begging or pleading to get someone to engage in a sexual act that they really don't want to do. Oftentimes, I think that people think of this as the aggressive form where we're threatening violence in order to get a survivor to comply. But I also want us to understand that coercion happens when a partner is saying things like, if you really loved me, we would have sex, or begging and asking over and over until a survivor feels like the only option they have is to say yes to the offender. Rape is what happens when non-consensual penetration happens with or without the use of force. And this really does include genitals, objects, or digits being put into the body. And when we talk about rape and penetration, we should probably have a shared definition of penetration, which is to the slightest degree of the law in most states, when an object or body part has been inserted just past the labia majora, or like just past the lips, or just into somebody's anus. Lastly, on my list, we have DSFA, drug-facilitated sexual assault. And this is when a mind-altering substance is used to make a survivor more pliable or controllable. I think people tend to immediately go to roofies when we're talking about DSFAs, especially because that is something that people can have, like survivors can take legal action against at any time. But this also happens when somebody is buying an individual's drinks continuously in order to get them like loosened up, or maybe mixing their drinks stronger than a survivor is aware of. In New Mexico, recreational marijuana is legal, so it's also a DSFA if a survivor goes to smoke weed with an offender and that weed was laced with fentanyl and they didn't know when they consumed the substance. So again, sexual violence doesn't always just come in the forms of ways that we can take legal action in. So now we're going to talk about programs that survivors can access. I like to share what my agency does because it shapes the perspective and framework that I come into this space with as a professional. And I recognize that sexual assault programming looks different in different areas. So I work for an agency that specifically works in rural counties in New Mexico. And I know that that doesn't necessarily look the same for those of you who might be chiming in from like an urban or metropolitan area. So my agency is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a crisis center and we serve 6 primary counties in New Mexico. I do say primary counties because we help survivors outside of our 6 counties either access services that aren't available to them locally or help them find the suitable provider where they're at. So often we're helping people from Texas. We're helping people from other small counties that are up against ours. Sometimes I even have people calling from like Colorado, New York, California, trying to figure out where to go. I don't always know how they get our numbers, but primary 6 counties here in eastern New Mexico. You'll also might notice that I said we're a crisis center and not a rape crisis center specifically, because my organization, like many in rural parts of the country, ends up kind of being a catch-all for violence. So our specialty is sexual assault and domestic violence, but we do also the place where people who have experienced strangulation or elder abuse or child abuse might come to get care. And a lot of times, if you're chiming in from a rural area, your nonprofit organizations also act as the catch-all in your place. So rape crisis centers or sexual assault programs typically have the 4 categories of services that you see on the screen: forensic exams, advocacy, counseling, outreach, and prevention. If you're not from New Mexico, where you can get these will vary widely. And I mean that to be where locally is one, how far you have to drive, what programs are available. I do know, because I did my research, that every state does have a sexual assault service provider. There is not a state in the United States right now that doesn't have any type of programming. It does vary pretty wildly state to state, but every state at least has one sexual assault program in them. Your sexual assault programs in your areas should operate pretty similarly. If they have a SANE nurse or a SANE exams, which stands for sexual assault nurse exams or examiners, those are the medical exams where a nurse kind of checks the survivor's body out head to toe, makes sure that there's no injury and that they're okay. They can also, sorry, a notification popped up on my side that y'all can't see. So I gotta like get that out of my way, please. Thank you. They can also collect DNA evidence and take like forensic photography. My agency also treats sexually transmitted disease and provides emergency contraceptive if requested by survivors. And then if a survivor is choosing to engage with the legal side and go through court and seek charges for their offender, my SANE nurses will go and testify as expert witnesses about what happened, what they saw, what the injuries looked like for court. We also provide counseling. I know there are mental health providers in the room with us right now, and mental health providers come in all sorts of types, flavors, and specialties. There is so many ways that therapy can be approached. At a rape crisis center, therapy is approached through the lens of how does one recover from sexual abuse and sexual trauma. Most of the time, these services are available to anybody, regardless of how far out from the trauma is. So a lot of times this looks like adult survivors of child sexual abuse coming in and seeking services because something has happened in their adult life, and now they are having to reprocess that trauma. My agency is also lucky. We are presently onboarding a domestic violence specialist right now. So hopefully within the next coming weeks, we will be able to have a DV certified therapist as well for our area. And then advocacy, which will be what we spend a lot of time going on, is the part of programs that supports survivors day in and day out. Most agencies that have a 24-hour like crisis line or a helpline, as we call it here, the advocacy staff is who runs that. And advocates provide that immediate support. They do peer-to-peer models where we help emotionally regulate survivors going through crisis response. They help access resources and supports. They can get the referrals for internal supports, but also advocates at crisis centers typically know who in community is the most important touchstone to send a survivor through. This is where we create the space that survivors can be heard and navigate options without judgment. And like I said, lots of time today that we're going to talk about that. And then lastly, the 4th program that most rape crisis programs have is outreach and prevention. They might call it one, they might call it the other. Here in New Mexico, it's both together. And this is when we go out into community as advocates, but instead of being reactive in our response after trauma or violence has happened, we try to prevent it. We go and we teach individuals any information that is directly related to ending violence in community. So that would be things like, what is consent culture? What are healthy relationships? How do we end violence? What is bystander intervention and how do we practice that? But we also teach anything that we can walk back to ending violence. So we help people with budgeting. We help people with building resumes. We touch into marginalized communities and go like, hey, let's talk about how we build you up. Like, how do we make women become like educated, powerful speakers that like show up in space and take over that space a little bit. And all of that content gets tailored. So we don't talk to fifth graders the same way we talk to college students. I am not talking to law enforcement officers the same way I am talking to like the basketball players at my local college. So it is really tailored very specifically to what people needs. So everybody's homework assignment, and I think we do have a poll that will go up right now, is like, do you know who in your community you can go to as the source of truth for these? If you got a disclosure right now, right today, after we got off this call, can you name the places to access at least 3 of these primary crisis intervention services locally? And if you answer no, that's okay. But your homework assignment when we get off here is to immediately go jump on Google and go, all right, this is who is the source of truth for me. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about statistics and stigma. Sexual violence is really, unfortunately, pretty common in our lifetime. So the odds of you meeting somebody who has never experienced some sort of violence against them is pretty low. Also, I want to take a moment to say, if you've heard other numbers thrown around, like your agency uses different numbers, you've read a statistic online and you're like, that doesn't match what this man just told me. I want to remind you that the sexual assault sector is a pretty new area. We haven't spent a long history researching it or like normalizing talking about it in community. So 40 years ago, we thought 1 in 1 million women would be raped. And I would assume that there are people on this call right now who was alive 40 years ago when that was the standard. We also know that sexual violence is the most underreported crime. So the data can't be accurate if people aren't reporting it, if they aren't talking about it. In 2018, nationally, only 25% of survivors reported to law enforcement. So that left 75% who might not have disclosed to anybody at all. I'm not going to read every one of these fun graphics on the slide. I'm going to leave them up so that you can kind of glance at them and take what resonates with your role in community. But I do want to draw your attention to every 68 seconds an American is sexually assaulted. That is not sexual violence, right? This is a criminal act against their body. But every 68 seconds, somebody is sexually assaulted in America. How would that number change, right? If it was to include things that aren't protected under criminal law, if we were just looking at sexual violence? How would this number look if we rolled back more protections for survivors in the future and changed some of our legal definitions of violence? Like 68 seconds is kind of a big number to begin with. It could be much smaller and still be accurate. I've also included some correctional facility data on here because my agency, like most rape crisis centers, has a PREA-specific program, which is Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so it's my job to kind of stay up to date on the prevalence of violence in detention centers. And nationwide, 82% of children and 60% of adults who are sexually abused in correctional facilities experience that violence by staff. So it feels very important to me that talking about ending sexual violence and supporting survivors is something that we do unilaterally across community roles and jobs and experiences, because this is a crime that has no discriminatory factors and anybody at any point could experience this violence. So we don't have a lot of time. So I'm narrowing my scope down really binary for a moment, and I'm not going to take into account the diversity of America, of New Mexico, of even like my community and what violence looks like. I challenge you to probably go do your own research and see what happens when we start intersectioning or like layering intersectionalities of like BIPOC experience or LGBTQ experiences or people who are disabled or in poverty. What happens when you start taking these marginalized identities and putting them on top of each other to the rates of violence that might happen to them? So right now, when we're bringing it narrow scope, men across America, 43% of them report experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime. Remember, that's our big umbrella, legal and non legal acts. Of all of the men in America, 1 in 6 will experience an attempted or completed rape. And 1 in 4 from our 1 in 6 were between 11 and 17 when they experienced their first, not their last, not their only, their first attempted or completed rape. I will also say that men do tend to report stranger rape more often than women do, with about 15% of the time, men don't know who their offender are. And then on the flip side, right, when we look at women, 97% experience sexual violence in their lifetime. That's a real big number, I think. 1 in 4 will experience an attempted or completed rape. And of our 1 in 4, 1 in 3, again, between 11 and 17, when their first, not their only, not their last, attempted or completed rape happened. And then the data for men is a bit hard to find, but it is easy to find for women that 1 in 4 undergrads will experience an attempted or completed rape over the course of their 5-year degree. And 92% of women knew their offenders. I also find it not interesting because I know what I know about sex offenders, but 93% of juveniles also knew their offender. So there's oftentimes a big myth that rape and sexual violence happens by people we don't know. And the data tells us it more often is somebody who is close to us. So I just want everybody to think about those numbers for a minute. Maybe take a look at your team, take a look at your social circle, take a look at your family. Think about how these numbers show up in your community. Someone in every place you have stepped into is at risk. I also, again, with that homework assignment, maybe reach out to your local organizations and let them tell you what these statistics looks like specific for your community. Most states have a coalition that collects this data. And I know in New Mexico, that's the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, NMCSAP. It allows me to go see what every program in my state has done for a year and what crime has looked like in our state. So if you want to know how these numbers boil down in your community, ask your coalition, ask your sexual assault programs, find out what violence looks like locally for you. You'll notice that my men's data was a little bit different, and that is because men are the least likely to report. Opening up that Canva Live space again. When you hear me say that men are the least likely to report, do we have any idea why? What might be some reasons or barriers that exist for men to reporting? Did we all get kicked out of Canva Live for some reason? If you were in the Canva Live, I think y'all got kicked out, but I see we have the Zoom answer. I can also give anybody the opportunity who was on it via their phone to scan a new QR code. I do not know why we got kicked off, so I apologize, friends. Fantastic. I'm going to hide this because some of y'all are back. Some of y'all are answering. I don't want y'all to feel pressured to see everybody's answers on the screen. We got some good answers. We got stigma, we got pride, we got shame, embarrassment. Men aren't always believed, afraid it will get turned around on them. Yeah, those are some great answers. As a masculine identified person, I'll share there's a lot of barriers for men, a lot that y'all are dropping in the chat right now and kind of mentioning. But the two biggest contributing factors are always going to be stigma. And then if we pull all the roots off the top of everything else, colonization. Most rape crisis centers and domestic violence centers have names, colors, ads, conversations. that favor feminine and child survivors, right? When we think about the ideal or the typical sexual violence survivor or domestic violence survivor in our head, it is typically like some young female. And men and masculine people are alienated from supports, right? They're not the marketed demographic. They're not who most people are thinking about. Men are supposed to be the villain, not the victim, right? And we even see this play out when young masculine people are offended on by older feminine people, right? The locker room culture, the locker room talk is usually praise. Like, how'd you bag a baddie? How'd you get with the teacher? Oh my goodness, so good for you. And it's like the normalization of the victimization of males, because on the opposite side, when a feminine student is offended on by an older male teacher, everybody's like, throw the book at him, lock him up, give him the most intense we can give him, because she needs to be protected at all cost and recover the innocence that she has lost. And it is the opposite for men and boys when they experience this. Like, we have normalized the victimization of young male and only made adult males the people that go bump in the night. And then we talked about like the embarrassment piece of it, right? And cases of a male offender on another male individual. As a society, we've made being gay like one of the worst crimes you could commit against masculinity. So experiencing a level of violence that might have somebody else perceive me as gay means that we have a whole group of people who won't go get help. Advocates in the chat might know that when you talk to male survivors about their trauma, about the violence that they have experienced, we're not calling it rape. We're not calling it sexual assault. I am very lucky if I can get men to agree that they experienced sexual violence or that they really did experience a crime against them. We kind of talk around sexual violence rather than at it with men, because they have this internalized and deep shame wound around experiencing violence. I also would say that we have told men that they're not allowed to express feelings, right? And survivors have a lot of feelings. And so showing emotion has really been socialized out of especially the older generations of men who cannot be vulnerable and approach their violence and approach their trauma and unpack it. So I really encourage everybody here right now, when we go step out of this, to maybe spend some time unpacking any learned biases that we might have, so that we can have communities of masculine identified people that can have support to come forward and to come out and to heal out loud and very vibrantly before we continue to lose them in silence like we do right now. I'm also going to share with you, as a masculine identified person, I don't think our numbers for men are correct. I think that they're low. I think if 97% of women are experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime, you cannot convince me only 43% of men are. That is such a low number. But it's not going to change. We're not going to see what sexual violence really looks like for men until we create these spaces where they feel like they have a place at the table, where they feel like they can come forward and talk to us, where they feel safe to disclose what is going on and what is happening in their lifetimes. And I know that's a big undertaking, but I'm sitting in a room right now of so many of y'all that can go out and start this process in community locally where you're at. On that note, right, when we're talking about mental health and how that happens, I do want to share a little bit about the mental health part that survivors experience. It's estimated right now that about 94% of sexual assault survivors experience the symptoms of PTSD. You'll notice I say symptoms of PTSD, not they are diagnosed with. A lot of survivors will not call their experience PTSD. I know where I'm at over here in rural New Mexico. PTSD is a war-associated diagnosis. Nobody else can have it. And so a lot of times survivors aren't going and like getting the official diagnosis. Maybe they're not seeking the diagnosis, but they're sharing with their care team that they're having flashbacks, that they're having emotional dysregulation, that they're feeling stuck in the trauma and like they can't get past it, that the trauma that happened is really negatively impacting kind of various areas of their life. Then that would be the symptoms of PTSD. Survivors often have significant rates of depression and anxiety that also kind of goes hand in hand with PTSD, but it does show up at higher rates than like the general public. Often survivors too have a substance use issue or a substance use disorder, an addiction that they might be struggling with. I'm going to tell you, substance use is 100% a normal trauma response to any form of abuse. Do we like it? Is it our favorite response? Is it our favorite coping skill? Absolutely not. It's a maladaptive coping skill, to be sure, but it is a normal response to experiencing the deep trauma that sexual assault survivors have to cope by using substances. Studies right now are showing pretty big numbers. The most common I could find was about 13%, or 13 times, not percent, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol and 26 times more likely to abuse drugs. And often I would like to let you know that sexual assault and domestic violence survivors are getting introduced to these substances by their abusers. And then it becomes the coping skill to process the trauma. They also have high rates of self-harm or suicidality. Again, normal trauma response, not my favorite, but a normal one. Approximately 14% of survivors are at risk of self-injury, and then 1 in 3 who have PTSD report attempting suicide. We just said 94% of them are experiencing symptoms of PTSD. So 1 in 3 of that 94% would be quite a lot of our population struggling mental health wise after experiencing violence. Oftentimes, whatever your role is in community, if it's not directly a crisis center worker, the first time we engage with a survivor is not through the lens of the sexual violence trauma. It's for the symptoms, right? Law enforcement might be getting called out on a welfare check for somebody who's expressing suicidality. Somebody who's a mental health provider might be seeing somebody who came in with a substance use disorder. Those are the symptoms to the original problem, to the root of the issue. But the symptoms are what typically get our attention first, right? If somebody's expressing that they're struggling with depression when they come in and they see you for the first time, you're not going, well, clearly there's sexual trauma that happened, and they most likely are not telling you that there's sexual trauma happening. They're like, let's address the depression. And so it's important to kind of know that these are normal things because you're going to see them first, probably, before you ever get that disclosure. If you're like, hey, Guy, why are we talking about advocacy? I'm going to direct you to this number right here, this 80% for my statistics last year. When we started talking about statistics, 25% of survivors on average report to law enforcement. 80% of the survivors that came in through Arise to get services, that got advocacy, that did SANE exams, that got counseling, 80% of them reported. Because that's at the heart of why we're having this conversation. When survivors are supported, when they have somebody who's in their corner, when they have somebody who is listening non-judgmentally and making them feel safe, secure, and supported, they can do the hard things. The legal process is a hard thing. It is quite emotionally draining to go take your offender through the court process. It is long, it is daunting. You are having people question if you really did experience trauma or what you did that could have made that trauma somehow your fault. And so an advocate standing in your corner, listening, supporting you, changes how they recover quite differently. 80%, if I did a really fancy calculator, is I think like a 200% increase from 25% of survivors. So this is why we're having this conversation, because I want you to walk out of here and be able to make that number bigger in your community. so that hopefully at some point as a nation, we no longer need to talk about sexual violence because it's a thing of the past that we have gotten rid of and no longer worry about. No, this is your turn now. Those numbers aren't mine.
Yes, thank you so much, Clarence. This presentation is so great so far. Okay, so quick announcement. For attorneys in the states of Nebraska, Texas, and Washington, you will need to include the following attendance code in your evaluation form. The code is 266857. Once again, the code is 266857. I will post this in the chat box. Actually, my coworker Melissa will post it in the chat box. We'll post it a couple of times for you, but please make note of this if you are an attorney in these states. And Clarence, back to you.
Fantastic. All right, now we get to do the fun part. Now we're going to talk about advocacy and why everybody is going to walk out of here and you're going to be a super great advocate and take back critical skills to your community. I'm not going to read the definitions that are on the screen, but as you can see from the definitions, anyone at any time in any practice at any role in community be an advocate, right? I keep saying I'm not standing, I'm sitting, but I am in a room full of future advocates right now or current advocates who might be learning something new about their role. The main difference between myself and potentially other people on this call is simply that I have dedicated my time to attending lots of trainings to learn how to support survivors and heal my community with the super fun added bonus that I have a company that now pays me for what I used to do for free. That's it. Anybody can be an advocate at any point. It really just means we support somebody. We use our voice when somebody needs us to use our voice to plead their case. So you might be going, why? Why are we doing this? It's really difficult to find clear data about the importance of advocacy and survivor advocacy. Again, right, this is a new sector. There's ever evolving best practices. There's too little funding going around nationally for organizations like mine, and crisis centers typically routinely face staffing shortages. This is really hard work. It's also the most rewarding thing that I have ever had the pleasure of being a part of, which is why I encourage others to join too. So somebody who is advocating, and when they have either a professional advocate or somebody who's standing in and advocating for them, here's some things that we know happen. We know that law enforcement might take the case more seriously. I'm going to assume law enforcement in the room with us right now are the ones who are already taking this really seriously. I live in rural New Mexico. There is an education piece that sometimes does not translate well, and law enforcement doesn't always understand like a trauma response and what happens to the body when trauma happens. So an advocate gets to go and help facilitate that conversation. And now a survivor feels supported, and a law enforcement officer might have more education that wasn't part of their initial training. We already talked about it. 80% of my survivors report because survivors feel empowered to report when they have somebody who helps them get through all of the stickiness of trauma. They can take the next steps that are important for them. They also tend to receive a lot more information about STIs and are more likely to get treatment. Somebody calls into my agency needing a SANE exam, talking about treatment or testing is one of the first conversations we're having, which means that we are decreasing rates of STIs in community. It also can decrease survivors' negative feelings. We're putting really big quotations around that because all feelings are valid, all feelings are good, all feelings should be have. What we are counting as negative feelings are the ones that make it harder for us to get through our healing journey. So things like embarrassment, shame, depression, anxiety, suicidality. Having somebody in your space who tells you these things are normal and it's okay to be feeling them allows you to process them quicker so they don't hinder recovery. And then advocates love sending people off to get more ongoing help. And so survivors are more likely to seek ongoing help if they feel like somebody has supported them the entire time. They'll trust the referrals that an advocate gives them. They'll trust the referrals you give them because you advocated on their behalf all of this time and you built that rapport, so they trust your judgment and advice. when we talk about advocacy in practice, I want y'all to know that most survivors are never going to interact with the legal sector. They're never going to go report to law enforcement. They're never going to go try to have a day in court. A lot of times we're not even helping them turn in like restraining orders, DBOs, depending on where you're at. They're not doing that. So advocacy isn't about like, let's get you justice. Advocacy is about support on healing journeys. So often I have survivors that come in and they go, I placed my phone call. I told the advocate, I got the SANE exam. I went and I saw the counselor and I checked all of my pretty little boxes. And in 5 to 6 business months, I am going to be healed and recovered and my trauma will never impact me again. And any of us who have been doing this in the room knows that's not how healing works. Okay, we don't check off boxes and we go on a pretty nice trajectory. It is chaotic, it is messy, it is back and forth, and it is heavy work. So advocating for a survivor looks like checking in with them on this journey. How are they doing physically? How are they doing emotionally? What's their mental well-being like these days? How are they holding up right now in this moment? It could look like maybe we provide them up-to-date resources because the people in this room should be the people in community who know where the expert subject matters are locally. It can look like talking about safety plans and concerns. It could look like, how do we share this trauma with somebody else, right? Advocacy can look like, how do I tell my partner about what my best friend just did? It can also look like, let's navigate new coping skills. Like advocacy is not, we tell survivors what to do, right? We don't fix survivors. That's not what advocacy is about, the way that maybe going and seeing a counselor is, although I would argue counselors are not fixers either. They're supportive measures as well. But advocates never tell a survivor what to do. If they ask me directly what they should do, I repackage that problem real nicely and hand it straight back to them, because advocates give survivors space to take their power and control back, right? That's what sexual violence is. It is the removal of power and control. So we want them to be able to make all of their important decisions. And we do this by, we build that rapport, we listen to them, we check in with them, we let them know that the thing that is happening right now is normal, that their response is okay, that they are not alone, which means all of you can do this, right? A law enforcement officer can tell a survivor that they're not alone and they're here for them right now. An advocate can tell them where to go get shelter if need be. Everybody can do this at any point. Great, super fun information. How do we identify them? What do we do when we see a survivor then? Let's talk about that. I really, really wish that I could hand you like a checklist of an easy way for you to clock survivors the second they walk into a room with you. If the data that we just talked about didn't make it clear, anyone at any point can be a survivor. This is a crime that doesn't discriminate. Rich, poor, so heavy user, unemployed on welfare, unhoused, private villa, local, tourist, straight, queer, anyone at any time can experience sexual violence. I am 28 with 2 kids, married for 4 years, an advocate, college educated, and I am forever in recovery and forever a survivor. That is just how this works. You're gonna see people who walk in a extreme variety of presentations. Survivors exist on a spectrum. You will see people who are as independent and hypervigilant as often as you will see people who are shut down, who are reserved. You will see people who are hypersexual and engaging in risky sex behavior as often as you will see people who are sex repulsed and don't want to be touched. So I can't give you this checklist and you go, all right, well, they're unshowered, they're not wearing makeup, they are in between this age band, they're definitely a survivor. What I can do is tell you what we listen for, what we start paying attention to, and how we get to the point where a survival will tell us what is going on. Because if you attempt to take a cookie cutter approach to identifying and supporting survivors, you will miss them. They will not talk. They will not engage. So here, I'm going to have you take into consideration. You're going to remember that spectrum. They can show up however they need to. And this doesn't just happen on a case-by-case basis, but that spectrum can shift throughout their healing journey. You might have somebody walk in and they are so codependent and locked into cycles. And then 6 months into working with them, they are now hyper independent and, doing all of their own things with no support. You also need to probably be mindful about the neurobiology of trauma. Sexual violence is a trauma. So our brain is going to do what it needs to do in that moment to survive. And it doesn't matter how little or how extreme it is. Like, neurobiology doesn't kick in when you're getting like just raped enough. Neurobiology happens when your body goes, there is a threat and I have perceived it and I need to be safe. So survivors will experience fight, flight, freeze, and fawning. And I'm listing fawning because they might not say no, and they still experienced violence because what they needed to do to survive is what they did. And when we have one of those neurobiology responses, an incident, one, they can't control it. And two, it usually does mess a little bit with our survivors' memories. I have worked with survivors who can tell me every detail, down to the cologne, the shoe brand that their offender was wearing. And I have survivors who can't tell me what they did for the 48 hours before the incident occurred. Both of them exist. Both of them are valid. Both of them are still telling the truth. You should also be mindful for those of you who work in the field where you would learn about victimization. Much like other victimizations, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, have a negative impact on the likelihood of somebody experiencing sexual violence and sexual assaults. You can see if somebody has an ACE score over 8, they're almost at a 5 times more likely risk to experience sexual assault and sexual violence. If somebody experienced childhood sexual abuse, they're 3 times more likely to be re-victimized in adulthood and experience another sexual assault. So what happens is people start telling us their trauma history, and we go, oh, we need to be concerned because your childhood has normalized violence in your experience. And so I need to be aware that you might be at risk for being re-victimized. And then every state's data is going to vary pretty substantially. My Department of Health identified who was the most at risk in New Mexico. And in New Mexico, that's 18 to 44-year-olds are the group most disproportionately impacted by sexual violence. And then when you start layering on marginalized communities in our area, so disabled, anybody who's LGBTQ, they separate out trans and gender identities. Somebody who's female, somebody who's in a non-Hispanic household, and somebody who's in poverty, these are the communities who end up the most at risk. So somebody walking in to spend time with you in your role as an 18-year-old Black trans woman who's a wheelchair user, they're at more risk for violence than a 50-year-old white cisgender male who walked in to your office to get services. So we go, okay, I have to pay attention to these. That might be important information for me to hold on to. And then we take those important identifying factors and then compare them with this giant list of 10 things. Now, you all can have access copies of the slides, so I'm not going to read every one of these because I feel like 1 through 5 are the normal behaviors that we associate with trauma survivors. Instead, I want you to focus on 6 through 10, which is survivors typically come in overly alert into spaces. They are often hypervigilant. They could also have no safety awareness whatsoever, right? Again, that spectrum, they could be on either side, but you might have to be more mindful of somebody. They might be experiencing extreme psychosis with that hypervigilance. You might have to cover cameras or make sure you're always meeting in well-lit areas and closing blinds, things that you wouldn't think about and your day in at work are things that you might need to think about to work with a survivor. Again, we talked about it. Substance use and self-harm as normal trauma responses. It happens. And it's okay. Do we want them to recover? Absolutely. Would we like them to choose better coping skills? Absolutely. But they're going to do it, and that's all right. They might have disrupted milestones, especially if they were a childhood sexual abuse survivor, right? Like they might or having speech delays. And those are things that often have other, other diagnoses attached to it. If somebody is not speaking, we might send them to a speech language pathologist before we send them for a forensic interview. They might have inconsistent storytelling. I think this one often becomes the hardest ones for people who have roles that aren't primary trauma roles, like they're not working in the mental health sector, they're not working as advocates at a crisis center. Inconsistent storytelling is part of trauma. Okay, their memory, their story, it's gonna change as they work through their trauma. They might miss details or misremember things. You might get two different versions of the same story and be like, well, is that really true? Yeah, it still really is true in that moment because inconsistent storytelling happens with trauma. And then lastly, number 10, so important. Survivors will never disclose if they are not in a safe place. We can spend all this time talking about how you identify them, the really important skills you should have. If you did not create a safe place, they're not going to tell you they're a survivor. They have to feel like they can trust you. They have to feel like you're not going to judge them. They have to have that rapport. It only happens in safety. When I have new advocates come in to my agency, we literally spend over 100 hours working with them to work with survivors. I know some of you in other states probably do not spend that much time training new advocates. My advocates get put through a rigorous training before they can go out and interact with survivors. So I could spend all day talking to things. This is a condensed version. This is the too long didn't read. I assume everybody in the room would understand a little bit about the importance of like ethics and active listening skills and trauma-informed practice and being resilient and teaching resiliency and perseverance. I assume that we all have this understanding. So here are the two things I don't assume we all have the understanding for that are tools you need to put in your toolbox. We have to spend some time unlearning victim blaming. It is pretty learned or normalized in our society to have a little bit of victim blaming. People with the best intentions often still practice victim blaming behaviors, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and discouraging them from being able to disclose. How many people in this room, if they got a disclosure from a survivor, might say something like, oh my goodness, you need to go report this right now to the police. You could stop this from happening to somebody else. What if he does it again? They need to be locked up. How many people in this room might get a disclosure from somebody and go, oh my goodness, why didn't you call me sooner? Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have done something. Those have well-meaning intentions. They are still rooted in victim blaming. Do you know what a survivor hears when you say, you need to go report this so it doesn't happen to somebody else? They hear, if I don't report this, if I don't go through this process and he does it to somebody else, I'm to blame. I did it. Victim blaming happens when we remove any ounce of the offender's fault for what happened. And it happens not just in like the, what were you wearing? You knew better to go there. You shouldn't have drank that. I told you not to date him, sort of thing. It happens in those well-intentioned moments too. So spend some time, think about how you react to survivors when they come to you, and make sure that the survivor is always at the front of what you're doing. Every choice, every word that comes out of your mouth, every resource that you send them to has to have the survivor in front of it, not behind it, not beside it, in front of it. And then lastly, we got to work on an empowering mindset. I think a lot of times people work with survivors and get a little bit stuck in being fixers. I want to fix this problem. I want to help my community. I want to take care of all of these things. And we can't rescue survivors from their trauma. We have to empower them to get out of their trauma themselves. They need to have that control. Somebody took control away from them, and that's why they're a survivor now. And so we have to go, okay, what does reclaiming your power look like for you? I might know what I think is the best course of action for them, right? But I have to hold space for what they know is true for them. And then very importantly, we heal in community. This is not an individual work. This isn't on survivors to do by themselves. This isn't on rape crisis centers to do by themselves. This is a community issue. Sexual violence is a community issue. So we will only recover from a community issue if we get together and do it as a group. We have to put survivors at the front of what we're doing. We have to hold offenders accountable. We have to teach people how to not cause harm. We have to teach people the coping skills to recover from harm. We have to create spaces where everybody feels safe. Survivors do play a critical role in their own stories and true healing and recovery and repair, but it's never going to happen long lasting if the community doesn't take care of it, right? We talked about ACEs being a risk factor for survivors. Children need adults to protect them. Adults who were victimized as children need safe adults to show them what safety is. That only happens when we do this as a group, when we come. Survivors' ability to have healthy relationships are typically negatively impacted after they experience trauma. It's impacted with their relationship with themselves. It's impacted with their relationship with others. So they do inner work and we do community work to make sure they have safe places to go. We know where those safe places are. We become those safe places where they can be at. And that is how we get survivors not just healed. We take survivors from living to thriving, and we do that as a group. So I'm going to share with you my very important thing, which is that survivors have never been broken. They are not damaged. They are whole people with diverse needs, and they have always been whole and unbroken. No trauma, no place, no person can ever change that. Sometimes we just have to remind them of that and let them know it's okay. And if you have created a space where a survivor feels safe enough to disclose to you, don't panic, believe them. Even if the story feels unbelievable, I find that this becomes a hard part for people. Sometimes they're like, this doesn't feel true. It doesn't matter because it's true for them. So we believe survivors, we support them in what they need in that moment and accessing the resources they need. So one of my last questions that I want to leave you with before we jump to our conclusion is, what is one new or improved way that you're going to show up for survivors in your community? What is your commitment when you walk out of here after we've had this conversation to do? I'm not sure Canva Live is going to work. Oh yeah, we're still there. Y'all are still fine. We also have the Zoom. Thank you, Guardify team, for dropping in the Zoom poll. I really appreciate it. While y'all are thinking about that, I'm going to come to my conclusion why we close out this time, because I do want to try to give you space for some questions. Here's my final thought as we walk away. 68 seconds. I'm going to call you back to that number. During the time that we have been together today, at least 65 assaults will have occurred across the nation. 8 of those at minimum will have been children. For every 1,000 cases taken to court, only 25 offenders will face prison time, and most of them will be released typically within 3 years. That's why we have to have this conversation. That's why we have to talk about supporting survivors and community and not just advocates at rape crisis centers. This is why we have to talk with law enforcement and mental health providers and lawyers and your gas station local person, cashier, whatever we're calling them in this moment. This is why it is a community issue. These numbers will only get better if we do it together. And that's it. Here's some resources. Thank you. We've done it successfully. There's my
Clarence,
contact information.
what an amazing training. That was so, so good. The Guardify team were slacking each other back and forth, messaging each other back and forth about how great this has been. I have one question that I would like to pose to, actually a couple of questions, but the first one I'd like to pose to you since we have a few minutes for questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And this is in reference to slide 21. So if you can refer yourself back to slide 21. Someone asked, are these behaviors consistent for younger victims, or are there ones that might be more common for teens versus preteens versus young children and toddlers, et cetera?
I feel like this is 21. No, that's 23. We're going to call this 21.
Yeah.
I would love to tell you that there are universally age-specific behaviors. There are some things that I can say are a little bit age consistent. I would say things like inconsistent storytelling is much more frequent in younger individuals and older individuals, so our children and our elders, with our young adults having a little bit easier of a time with remembering their trauma, right? Children lack a lot of prefrontal cortex, they lack a lot of speaking skills and important ways to communicate those needs. And then I would say that things like excessive need for control and hypervigilance does more often show up with older individuals. However, at any age, any of these can happen, right? Like I could be a 6-year-old who has trust issues. I could be a 6-year-old who is showing up in a controlling way or not in a developmentally appropriate way for my relationship with these behaviors, that disrupted milestone part. So the only way to know which one of these which one of these behaviors is to the trauma the person you are engaging with has experienced is by having that rapport so that you can talk to them and find out what the root cause is for those behaviors.
Yeah. Great answer. Thank you so much, Clarence. Here's another question. Someone posed a scenario. A survivor discloses a sexual assault and their abuser has been charged. The survivor now wants to recant. How would you suggest we speak to the survivor to make sure that they feel supported and encourage them to still participate in the case?
My controversial hot take is you shouldn't try to get them to participate if they're telling you they don't want to. The way you would get them to participate is by telling them that you understand why they might not want to participate, or even having a conversation about, are we not participating because we're scared, and do we need to have safety measures be put in place instead? It's not, oh my God, you really need to do this because this guy needs to have his day, or this person needs to have their day in court, and you are a part of that process. I want anybody who's part of the legal system to think about homicide cases. We do not bring back the dead and force them to testify. But we're asking sexual assault survivors to go sit in a room and be questioned and told that they're not really a victim in order to get justice. There's reasons. That's a scary process. It's fair for them to be like, I can't do this anymore. So you have to get to their support needs. What do they need from you? What safety measures need to be in place? Like, what is at the heart of this issue, rather than let's get back on track for getting into court.
Right. Justice means a lot of things, and healing and safety is also, can mean justice for victims as well. So
Correct.
well, we have time for a couple more questions. Let me pose this one. How about the victims who want to recant after the case has been charged or don't want charges at all? Is that your same approach would be just to support them through the decision that they're making, or would you encourage them to do anything different?
I think it is still support them through the decision that they're making. For places where you might be seeing a lot of recanting, a lot of survivors' hesitation to figure out, or like for participating in the criminal justice place, I would also maybe check in to see if there is any community agencies that are participating in any sort of restorative justice practices. Because like we said, justice does not just look like we go to court, we got charges, they're doing jail time. That might not be what the survivor needs. Sometimes survivors don't want them to have the offender to have charges, but they would prefer them to go to like an intensive program to heal and recover. And that's what justice looks like for that survivor. And so I encourage people to maybe lean into programs in their areas that might do that. And I know restorative justice is bigger cities, well-populated, well-funding areas have access to that. Not everyone does, but it's worthwhile if they don't want the charges to see what do they need. What is justice look like for them?
Yeah, and kind of, in the reverse, someone posed a good question. How do you support the survivor that, really wants to go forward on a case, on a criminal case, but there's the negative outcome. The case gets dismissed, the case isn't accepted in the first place, and or for whatever reason. How do you support a survivor through that sort of outcome?
So that is actually what probably most of my advocates spend their time doing. The county I live in has a 64% dismissal rate for sexual assault cases. It's a pretty big number, not a big fan of it. And so the first and foremost thing is the emotional support and then the safety plan, right? Because a lot of times survivors who are pursuing legal justice are doing it because they want that safety component of the offender is away from us. There's also sometimes ways to get legal justice that isn't necessarily criminal charges. You can take somebody to civil court sometimes and get justice in that frame. So I encourage us to kind of explore what the need is in that moment. Do we need to talk about civil court? Do we need to talk about a restraining order? Do we need to talk about buying a security system for the house so that it is locked down and safe? Do we need a counseling referral? Because those are going to be some big feelings. And we might need somebody on board who can kind of help us unpack all of that hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, then I have one final question that I would like to end with. So we have someone asking questions specifically about a child disclosure. So how would you support children who give a solid disclosure, say in a forensic interview, and the perpetrator isn't around the child anymore, but then the child is suspected to have been coached by the parent and then recants their disclosure? Any words of wisdom on cases that have those case facts to them?
Oh, Lord, I know that changes like so drastically depending on what your role in community is, right? Like a law enforcement officer having to navigate that or a forensic interviewer having to navigate that looks real different than what I have to do. As an advocate hat on, when you wear it, you believe the survivor. Okay. I have survivors who share with me things that I know, like on the mental health side, are probably hallucinations and psychosis. It doesn't change that experience for them was real. Like the fear that they're feeling, real. The stress that they're feeling, real. Their anxiety, their emotional dysregulation, all of that is so real, even if the story wasn't. And I also would like to remind everybody that less than 2% of, reports are false. So it is more likely for you to get a genuine response than for a child to have been coached in that moment. And it might sound like coaching, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but with children, that number drops down, I think, even smaller to like 1% are false reports coming from children. Not necessarily there are adults involved, but children. It's more likely true. And so you need to find out what happened there. Like what safety measures need to be in place because the space you created wasn't safe enough.
Thank you. Okay, so this was posed by one of the attendees, but I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people on the call. So for anyone who is entering the field as a new advocate or about to take on a new position in this field, if you could close us out with, just 2 or 3 bullet points of words of wisdom you want everyone to take from this training as they go back out to do wonderful advocacy work in the world, what would you say?
We're going to believe survivors. We're going to believe disclosures. And then the one thing we didn't talk about in this training, that anybody who is entering this work, it is so important for you to know, please practice self-care. Please practice self-care. You cannot do this work if you don't take care of yourself. You're going to burn out. You're going to cause harm accidentally. If you're getting into this work and you're brand new, or, maybe you're feeling a little bit of that compassion fatigue because you've been doing it for a while, take care of yourself. Find hobbies that are not related to survivors and do them. Go get dinner and drinks with your friends if you're of age, please. And take care of yourself. We can only pour from a full cup, we're not pulling from kind of full cups. You're only supposed to give people your overflow. So take care of yourself so that you can do this work and take care of your community, because self-care is community care.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Put your oxygen mask on first. So
Put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. Always, friends.
well, thank you so much. It looks like we're reaching the end of our time today. Once again, everyone, please be on the lookout for an email later this afternoon. It'll be later in the day, so please don't expect it right after you sign off. It'll take me some time to get it all organized, but you will get an email today that will explain to you how to complete your evaluation form for attorneys needing CLE. That is where you will put in the code that you were given. And once you complete your evaluation form, that's how you will receive your certificate of attendance. And you will also be given information on how to contact Clarence if you want to reach out directly. Clarence, thank you so, so much for giving your time today. This was amazing. It was such great information. On behalf of all of us at Guardify, thank you so much, and we appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, and even if you're not from New Mexico, reach out. Shoot me an email.
Thank you so much.